So I'm going to talk for hopefully about 20 minutes, and I'm going to talk about like the Lasallian Institute, because I think that's like an important introduction that needs to happen before we can kind of understand what's going on with Maurin here. We're going to talk about what we know as far as Maurin's time in the LaSalle brothers. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some things that I see as connections between the Lasallian charism and the history of the Catholic worker as it is so far in terms of like how things have happened in the movement. And then Stefan's going to go, and we're all going to like kind of talk about everything. So let's go. First up, like why give this talk?
I'm sorry, Alex.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Can you switch where you're at? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. I forgot that the screen was there. So Peter Maurin grew up and received an education, a Lasallian education when he was a boy. And he was part of the Lasallian Institute for 9 years. So, you know, he was a brother, like, and he received the education in what would have been, I think, a pretty formative time of his life. And my hope overall in giving this talk is primarily to put like people who are interested in the Catholic worker in conversation with the Lasallian tradition, and likewise, like maybe someday when I give this talk back home, to put Lasallian people in conversation with the Catholic worker tradition. And I think that there's a lot that both like movements can kind of learn from each other. And as I mentioned before, I give like the history of Peter Maurin's involvement in the LaSalle brothers. I really kind of have to talk about the Lasallian Institute. And like with all movements, the Catholic worker is no exception, and also the Lasallian movement is no exception. We have to look at the founder, Saint John Baptiste de LaSalle, who, you know, his life and example and his actions during his life eventually led to the creation of the Lasallian Institute. So, Saint John Baptiste de LaSalle, right? There's all sorts of different shorter ways to say that. You can say, I'll say LaSalle, Jean Baptiste. A lot of times when you see people writing, you see SJBDLS or JBDLS. So I'm just going to say LaSalle as a short term because I don't like, it gets to be tongue twister after a while. So LaSalle was born in Reims in France in 1651. This is his childhood home. This home will become an important part of the story later. So while it is like kind of just like a he lived here kind of slide right now, it's important to the story in a little bit. LaSalle was born to a very wealthy family, right? So on his mother's side, his mom was Nicole Moet de Bruyet. And her family owned the winery business Moet and Chandon, which is a wine company that's still around, and it's a very like high quality, well known champagne. Yeah. So the family was super rich, and Jean Baptiste originally discerned that he had wanted to be a priest. And so when he was a young man in his teenagers, he entered seminary. And when he got to his late teens, early 20s, his mother and then father got sick, and they both like died 1 year after the other. So he had to like put his studies on hold. He did eventually finish his ordination and was ordained in 1678. But like during that period of his parents' illness, he had to like take care of his brothers and sisters. And part of that was he had to tutor his younger brothers and sisters, and he had to secure an education for them. So that was his first experience like being in education, and it was a very personal and like visceral thing for him, right, to have to go through. So he starts his vocation as a priest, but he, like, by the time he starts, he's like very, very interested in education, and it's well known in the city of Reims that he is interested in it. This is the Reims Cathedral. This is where he served as a priest. It's still there today. It's a beautiful church. So in 1679, LaSalle met a gentleman named Adrian Neal. He was an education reformer in France, and he would kind of travel around and open schools for the poor, right? Some of them, like the vast majority of them were Catholic schools, but some of them were state schools, etc. And he came into Reims, and he went to the Sisters of the Child of Jesus initially, seeking to open a school for poor girls in Reims, right? The Sisters of the Child of Jesus said, "We will work with you, but you have to bring in this priest, LaSalle, because he's like super into this stuff," right? So the sisters opened the school, and then Adrian, in collaboration with LaSalle, opened a school for poor boys in Reims. And this is an early example of a collaboration between like religious folk in the sense of the sisters, and Jean-Baptiste as a priest, and Adrian Nile, who was a not secular, but he was a lay education reformer. And that would be important to the rest of the story, as we'll see in a second. So Adrian Nile, opened these schools in Reims, and he started to kind of accumulate this following of teachers, lay teachers that were teaching in these schools that they had opened, and the teachers were looking for housing, right? So initially, LaSalle said, well, I'm super rich. Like me and my family, we're going to rent out a house for you, right? So these teachers are from these couple of schools in Reims are living in this house, and eventually, like, I don't know if you want to call it the lease. I don't know if they had leases back then, but they were eventually forced to move out, right? And so LaSalle invites the priests to come live with him in his family house. So if we go back, this house, right, that house. These teachers live there for a year or two, and then the rest of LaSalle's family becomes very frustrated with this, right? Because it's the family house. It's seen as having some like sort of sentimental value because both the parents had lived there and then died there, and so eventually LaSalle's sister sues him with her brother, or his brother-in-law, her husband, you know what I'm trying to say, and forces the house into sale, right? So LaSalle is forced to sell the family home, and he and the teachers that are living there are basically evicted, right? In that same year, LaSalle resigns as a priest, and he moves in with all these teachers at a rented house in Reims. Like slowly, like over the years, like these teachers living with LaSalle become increasingly religious, deeply religious. They start to adopt community prayer. They eventually start to wear habits, right? And they begin to call each other brother, right? And this is without any kind of like leadership direction from the bishop or the local religious authorities. They kind of just like start doing this, right? Meanwhile, Jean-Baptiste is like increasingly giving away more and more of his fortune. Like if you look up Jean-Baptiste de LaSalle on like Google Images, like half the pictures are just different artistic renderings of him just giving him money away. He just giving money away like crazy, right? And so this is a pretty famous rendering of this. This is an artistic depiction of LaSalle on the front step of his rented house after he left the priesthood, just giving away money off his front door step. This is kind of like, it's not quite an artistic rendering, but it's a floor plan of the house that they rented on Rue Neveu here in Reims, right? And so here on this image, it's called La Maison des Frères in Reims, right? But in LaSallian circles, this house is known as, well, we call it the cradle of the Institute, because this is like where the idea of the LaSallian Institute came together. And it's also where like these brothers become increasingly involved in like kind of what becomes religious life for them. So in 1686, about 5 years after they get like evicted from the LaSalle house, the brothers take a vow of obedience at the cathedral in Reims. This will later be expanded in like to more conventional full list of vows, as we'll see later. But from then on, they're considered like religious brothers, right? And so there's 8 initially, and the institute would then, grow and grow and grow. So a couple years after that, the LaSallian order, it's growing and growing. There's more schools opening throughout that region in France, and eventually, like the Christian Brothers and Saint LaSalle, well then just LaSalle himself, is accused of being sympathetic to Jansenism, which is, it was a theological movement that existed in 17th and 18th century France that attempted to, it's actually kind of a complicated history, but the thrust of Jansenism was that it was attempting to reconcile Catholic thought with Calvinism, which was very popular in Protestant circles at that time. And so Jansenism was eventually considered a heresy. LaSalle himself received a lot of scrutiny. And something that didn't help was the fact that LaSalle's brother, who was also a priest, was a Jansenist. So he was sort of guilty by association, right? And this becomes so intense that like LaSalle is actually called to Rome on multiple occasions to like give testimony about it. And in 1691, he and then two other brothers, Nicholas Vouillart and Gabriel Drolin, take onto themselves a particular like single-use vow called the heroic vow. And in the LaSallian world, what that means is that these 3 guys promised to each other that they would continue to run the schools, even if it was just them, and even if they were totally out of money and had to beg for money, and even if they like could only eat bread and water. And it did almost come to that, right? The persecution was very, very intense. But they did persevere, and by the time LaSalle died in 1719, there were 26 schools and over 100 LaSallian brothers in France. And 6 years after his death, the Brothers of the Christian Schools were formally recognized as a religious order by the Catholic Church. And in 1900, LaSalle was declared a saint. And we're still around today. Well, I'm not a brother, but I'm considered to be part of the LaSallian Institute. I'm one of the 100,000 lay faculty and staff that exist at our 1,100 schools around the world. Today, there are 3,000 brothers, so quite a bit more than the 100 that were around when LaSalle died, but quite a bit less than were at the peak of the LaSallian Institute. In 1900, 1900 AD was the peak number of LaSalle brothers overall. There are 14,000. So there has been a great decline, as many religious institutes and orders have experienced over the last 100 years. And I think that could be an interesting part of our discussion later, but there are rapidly fewer and fewer brothers. As you can see now, we're at less than 3 brothers per school. And like across the institute, there's over 1 million students. So it's an interesting position that the institute finds itself in. And when I say institute, I mean like the religious movement of the LaSalle brothers and the schools that they operate and such and so forth. So I have a slide here about the LaSallian charism. This has developed a lot over like the last 300 years. Obviously Saint LaSalle didn't have this nice like little graphic about it. But these 5 points are based on ideas that like originate back to LaSalle himself. And I think they're kind of important to consider when we look at not only Peter Maurin's time in the LaSalle brothers, but also after, like in the development of the Catholic worker. So not to read off the slide, but the 5 core principles of LaSallian schools are faith in the presence of God, not surprising considering it's a Catholic order, respect for all persons, inclusive community, quality education, and then a concern for poor and social justice. And that was taken very seriously. I mean, it's taken very seriously today and then throughout the history of the Institute. The LaSalle brothers have always felt that they have to live in the communities that they're teaching and live in the communities that they serve, right? So it's, and likewise in LaSallian pedagogy, there's this idea of like encountering the student, right? We were talking, it was interesting because yesterday there was a mention of St. Francis, not St. Francis, oh my God, Pope Francis, and his emphasis on encountering the believer, encountering people, like whether or not they believe or not. And that's always been something that's been part of like the LaSallian charism, in that like when you have a student, like you kind of encounter each and every student as like a person primarily, right? So it's interesting to me to hear all this talk this weekend about personalism, because I feel like there's such an interesting dynamic there in relation to the LaSallian ethos. So where does Maurin come in, right? Man of the hour. And as we've learned from this weekend, the history of any movement often starts with its founder. So as we just talked about LaSalle, now we got to talk about Maurin in relation to the LaSallian movement. Like I mentioned before, Peter Maurin was in like the LaSallian Institute as a brother, like during a very important time of his life, like throughout his teens and early 20s. But he was also part of the LaSallian Institute during an important time in the Institute's history, as we'll see. In fact, probably one of the most important times in its history. But we'll get to that. Quick biography. I'm sure you guys will hear other people talk about Peter Maurin's just biographical stats, so to speak. But Peter was himself born in 1877 in Salle, how do you pronounce? Salle, there you go, I got it. In the province or district of Luzerne? Region of Luzerne, there we go. And he was one of 24 children. Imagine that, that's crazy, right? 24 children. And he was educated like as a boy, like with the local LaSallian Christian Brothers. But in terms of like what his childhood was like, I always like this quote. This is Dorothy Day quoting. This is quoting Dorothy Day quoting Maurin, describing his own childhood. So Dorothy says that he describes himself as such. I am a French peasant. I was born on a farm in the south part of France. My family owned the farm for 1,500 years, since the time of St. Augustine. We had 7 cows, some sheep, and a mare. We used oxen to plow the fields. We raised most of the food we ate. My father worked the land until he was 90 years old. And it's he puts it better than I could. I mean, it's just so simple and straightforward. I love the way he describes it. But yeah, so in 1893, Peter Maurin joins the novitiate of the De La Salle Christian Brothers. He had taken a habit, so he was wearing the black with the collar in 1895, and he took temporary vows. And his religious name was Brother Adorator Charles. And he had renewed his vows every year until 1902, which at what point he was like sort of confronted with the opportunity to take his final vows, which would be permanent vows in the order. And he declined that opportunity and left the Christian Brothers. So I also want to talk about, because for a great deal of his time in the Brothers, he was a novitiate. And so being a novitiate is sort of a junior status. And so during this time, he's teaching, but he's also being prepared to join the order, right? So he was trained, he was placed at different schools, and he worked with students. And the whole idea of it is that eventually you take these final vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and the vow of teaching the poor gratuitously. And obviously, like when you take the final vow, like your vow is to remain in the institute. So he took all these vows except that last one, just on a temporary basis annually. So an early part of his youth, like his teenage years and 20s, would have been living in poverty, chastity, obedience, and in that vow of teaching the poor gratuitously. And again, I'll talk about this more later, but in those vows, I really just see so much of what Maurin became and what Maurin imparted onto the Catholic worker. So with that said, why did he leave, right? It's not clear. As you guys all know, we have to do more research to get a super crystal clear answer on why it is he left the brothers. There's been a little bit of bits and pieces here and there that kind of give hints about why he left. There was a gentleman in the 1950s who did, I think, a PhD thesis on Peter Maurin called Peter Maurin Propagandist out of Ottawa University. And he had a little bit of correspondence with the Visitor General of Maurin's district that he taught in France. His name was Brother Isidore. And we'll look at some slides of the letter, but basically the Visitor General who had known Maurin basically speculated that it was not the right field, maybe teaching wasn't for him, which is interesting, but yeah, we'll take a look at it here. Oh, and actually, I thought this was an interesting tidbit too. So in the August 1993 Catholic Worker, there's a gentleman named Herbert Rogers who was a Jesuit, and he emphasized Peter Maurin's upset at having to serve in the military, during his time in France. He kind of hints that maybe he thought that the brothers would be able to shield him from compulsory military service. During his time in the brothers, he did serve 2 years in the French military. So that could be an interesting avenue to pursue in terms of research as well. Another thing to consider is, and James and I have had long talks about this, during the turn of the 20th century, there were waves of secularization laws in France, kind of known as the laic laws. And the Lassallian brothers in particular were badly affected by these laws because these secularizing laws, for one thing, they instituted separation of church and state in France, but you have to consider in that context where the state had been assisting and funding these brothers' schools, and also just allowing them to have their own standards and stuff. It's quite devastating to have that kind of all pulled out from under you. And so that period of time was a very trying time for the Lassallian brothers because at that time they were primarily in France, maybe entirely in France if I remember. And these laws were severe enough that it kind of pushed the Christian brothers out of France. So while they stayed in France to some extent, they moved to Spain, they moved to Germany, they moved to the US. And yeah, no, just interesting time for the brothers. And because it was so difficult and that time overlapped with Maurin's time in the brothers, there's a chance that it could have affected his experience. So with that in mind, this is that letter from Brother Isidore, and we're going to look at a couple excerpts here. But something that I really like about this letter is that it has a list of Maurin's mutations, right? And so for Lassallian brothers who are originally French, and even up till today, the idea of the mutation is actually just a station, it's your post. And so there's a list of places here that he was stationed at, and you'll notice, so he's at Issy in St. Nicholas, Charonne in Paris, then he has 2 years of military service, and then he's at another Lassallian school in Neuilly near Paris. Then he's in Versailles, and then finally Vajor right before he leaves the institute. And so, like, during his time in the Brothers, like I said, he still has 2 years of military service. One of those schools still exists. This is St. Nicholas School in Issy. So this is one of the schools that Peter would have taught at. Also, thanks to research by James and Matthew, we know that, Peter, first of all, had 24 brothers and sisters, and he wasn't the only one amongst them to enter religious life. There was at least 3 other brothers of his that also joined the Lasallian schools. Celestin Maurin, Anselm Maurin, Julienne Maurin, and then 2 of his sisters joined the Sisters of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. So we have Marie Clementine and Marie Baptistine. What's particularly tragic is that Celestine here, the top guy, actually was eventually sent to North America by the Christian Brothers, but Peter Maurin never knew that. So he was sent to Spain, and then he was sent to Mexico, and then eventually, I think, made his way into the American Southwest. And shortly before he died, he had sent a letter to Peter Maurin, which kind of got lost and sent around. And I think you guys know the story better than me, but like the letter arrived at the Catholic Worker about 10 years after Peter Maurin died. And so then another sad story, Anselm here, died at the age of 19 of tuberculosis. But yeah, it's interesting, and there's definitely a lot more work to be done, like considering the proximity between the Maurin family and the LaSalle brothers. I think there's probably a lot there, actually, if we get into it. So after Peter Maurin leaves the Lasallian Institute, he's in France for another 7 years, exposed to the writings of Kropotkin, Marx, St. Francis of Assisi, so many others. And he's also a member of Les Sillons, as we'll talk with Stéphane about later. And then he leaves France, right? He wanders around for years and then finally arrives in New York City and meets Dorothy Day in 1932, and the Catholic Worker newspaper is founded the next year. Maurin is deeply involved in the workers' houses of hospitality and the worker farms, and one of his favorite things to do is hold roundtables like this. And as we learned from Lincoln, or as we probably know in general, his easy essays are published and republished as a means of communicating the aims of the Catholic worker. So now we're going to get into like the kind of abstract stuff a little bit. I want to talk over the next couple slides about connections I see between Lasallian methods and Peter Maurin's general approach. So Brendan Grady, the gentleman who wrote that PhD thesis on Peter Maurin and the Christian Brothers, well, among other things, wrote, LaSalle recommended as teaching techniques the repetition of key ideas, simplicity of expression, conciseness, accuracy, and phraseology adapted to the understanding of average students. Techniques, obviously, that we all know, Peter Maurin constantly employed. Peter Maurin died at Newburgh Catholic Worker Farm on May 15th, 1949, which is also the same day that LaSalle died, May 15th, and was for a long time, and still is in many circles, celebrated as the feast day of LaSalle. And what I think is interesting is that Peter Maurin's death was commemorated alongside LaSalle's feast day for the first couple years after Peter Maurin's death. And this is actually Peter Maurin's grave, which is in, I think, upstate New York? Queens, there we go. So the Conway family, yeah, James was actually telling me about this the other day. So it was a grave that was like kind of, there was an extra spot and they brought him in. So more connections that I think, just super abstract, that I think are interesting to talk about. So both the LaSalle brothers and obviously the Catholic Worker is like super reliant on communities of voluntary association, right? So, and in that sense, like communities of voluntary association that are designed to like serve a specific constituency, right? and as I have as a second bullet point, like living amongst the constituency of the people that are served in both cases is a big deal. Further, in the Catholic Worker and in the LaSallian Institute, there's a great deal of significance placed on lay participation, right? As we saw, like in the history of the LaSalle brothers, like it kind of began as a bunch of guys living together, right? And increasingly today, the LaSallian Institute is like driven by its lay staff and faculty. As the Catholic Worker has always been super connected to, obviously driven by lay participation. Both movements, at least both movements I think in Maurin's mind, had a huge emphasis on education, right? 3 minutes? Okay. I gotta talk faster. Gotta pump me up with some coffee, y'all. So, I mean, we have the Agronomic Institute, the easy essays, the roundtables, the emphasis on voluntary poverty, and also vocation. I think we could have an interesting discussion about the meaning of vocation in a LaSallian context and in a Catholic Worker context. Mutual recognition of LaSallians and workers between each other. So after Peter Maurin died, Dorothy Day spoke at a number of LaSallian institutions. He spoke at LaSalle University, where I'm from, twice. In 1968, she talked in Barrystown, New York, to a Christian Brothers novitiate. And she talked at the Manhattan College in the Bronx. Following her talk at the Manhattan College, the Christian Brothers donated 35 pounds of shrimp to the New York City Catholic Worker House. Likewise, Dorothy Day was recognized with an award at Manhattan College, the St. LaSalle Medal, as you can see her receiving the medal here. In that photo, we have Brother Gregory Nugent. It's a great photo. He's super happy to give it to her. So this is another snippet from the letter from Brother Isidore that had been written to Brendan Grady, basically just saying, no hard feelings with Peter. You know, he was a nice guy. I'm glad that he's still doing good work up there in the United States. And then, this will be my last point because I think we need to wrap up. I was able to identify at least 2 Christian brothers that live or have lived in Catholic worker houses. So the top guy, we have Brother Dennis Murphy, who died in 2017. He lived in Catholic worker houses in Winona, Santa Fe, Chicago, and Albuquerque. And I think he was one of the founders of Sukasa House here in Chicago. And then on the bottom, we have Brother Louis Rodman, who has been a member of a Catholic worker house in Kansas City since 1982. I don't know which one. That'd be interesting to ask our friends from Kansas later. There's some mentions of Catholic education throughout the easy essays. In fact, education in general comes up a lot. So, especially the one bourgeois colleges, I think is interesting to look at in this context. I think that, Peter Maurin probably had some kind of oblique level of critique about the state of Catholic education, and especially in LaSallian institutions in America, but we can also speculate on that. I have a slide here about what LaSallians and workers can learn from each other. I think we'll save that for the conversation because I think that could be interesting. And then finally, I just want to bring up a couple of things that the LaSallian Institute is thinking about independently on its own right now. There has been a huge push this year and last year particularly to re-emphasize what they call the peripheries. Here's a screenshot from the document, but primarily the LaSallian Institute is refocusing itself on education constituencies that are outside the mainstream. Again, need more time to talk about it, but and finally, I thought this was interesting to bring up. This is my last slide. The LaSallian idea of the heroic vow was brought up again during COVID-19 because internationally it was a very stressful financial time and a bunch of schools had to close. So there was a group of LaSallians who took a COVID-19 era heroic vow in order to keep the idea of the Institute going. So not really related to Maurin too much, but I thought it was kind of a cool thing. Anyway, I thank you guys so much for your time. I'll pass it off to Stefan, and I look very much forward to talking about this history and these ideas with you guys in a little bit.